malicious compliance landlord cheated with my GF, so I made him evict himself. The sound of my girlfriend moaning through the thin apartment walls at 2 a.m. should have been my first clue, but I was an idiot who thought she was just having vivid dreams. I'm Jake, 26, and 3 months ago I thought I had my life figured out. Great girlfriend of 2 years, decent apartment in a sketchy but affordable part of downtown, and a job that paid enough to keep us both fed while Sarah finished her nursing degree. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. Our landlord, Rick Castellanos, was the kind of guy who wore gold chains unironically and called every woman sweetheart in that oily way that made your skin crawl. Mid-40s, pot-belly, receding hairline he tried to hide with too much gel. The man owned half a dozen rundown properties around the city and drove a BMW that was probably worth more than most of his tenants made in a year. From day one, something felt off about how he looked at Sarah. The way his eyes would linger when she answered the door in her scrubs after a clinical rotation. How he'd always find excuses to stop by when I wasn't home. But Sarah laughed it off, said I was being paranoid, that Rick was harmless. He's just being friendly, she'd say, rolling her eyes. Not every guy who talks to me is hitting on me, Jake. I should have trusted my gut. The walls in our building were paper thin, and I'd gotten used to hearing Mrs. Chen's TV shows, the college kids upstairs blasting music, and the general symphony of urban living. But those sounds at night were different. Rhythmic. Urgent. And they were coming from directly above us, the apartment Rick kept as his office, but I'd never seen him use for anything except storage. Last Tuesday, everything clicked into place in the most devastating way possible. I'd left work early with food poisoning, something I ate at that sketchy taco truck. Stumbled home around 2 p.m., keys jingling as I tried to work the stubborn lock on our door. That's when I heard them. Not just the sounds, but voices. Sarah's laugh, the one she used to reserve for me. And Rick's voice, low and smug. Your boyfriend's at work, right, sweetheart? Until 6, Sarah replied, and there was something in her tone I'd never heard before. Sultry. Confident. Nothing like the tired nursing student who'd been too stressed for intimacy for the past 3 months. I stood there in the hallway like a statue, grocery bag of soup and crackers in my hand, listening to my world implode. The sounds that followed made me want to punch a hole through the wall, but instead I did something smarter. I pulled out my phone and started recording. See, here's the thing about Rick Castellanos that I'd learned over 18 months of dealing with his lazy property management: the man was arrogant to a fault. He cut corners everywhere, ignored maintenance requests, and treated tenant laws like suggestions. He'd been getting away with it for years because most of his renters were young, broke, or desperate enough not to fight back. But I wasn't most renters. I'd spent 2 years in pre-law before switching to accounting, and my dad had been a contractor for 30 years. I knew exactly what Rick was doing wrong, and more importantly, I knew how to prove it. As I listened to my girlfriend betray everything we'd built together, a cold fury settled in my chest. Rick thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn otherwise. I spent the next hour sitting in my car in the parking lot, fighting between rage and nausea while planning my next move. The recording on my phone was clear enough: Rick's voice, Sarah's responses, and timestamps that proved this was happening during normal business hours when he should have been managing properties, not screwing his tenants' girlfriends. But I needed more than just evidence of the affair. I needed leverage. When I finally went back inside around 4 p.m., Sarah was already home, acting like nothing had happened. She was in the kitchen making dinner, humming some song I didn't recognize, looking more relaxed than she'd been in months. Hey babe, you're home early, she said, not even looking up from chopping vegetables. Feeling better? Yeah, much better, I lied, watching her perform this charade. Actually, I think I'm going to take a walk around the building. Get some fresh air. That's when I started my real investigation. See, Rick's biggest weakness wasn't just his arrogance, it was his laziness. The man had inherited these properties from his uncle and had been coasting on rental income for years without properly maintaining them. But more importantly, he'd been so sloppy with documentation that he'd created a legal minefield. I started with our lease agreement. Really reading it this time, not just skimming like I had when we first moved in. The thing was a mess: contradictory clauses, missing required disclosures, and several terms that were outright illegal under state tenant protection laws. But the real goldmine was Section 12, property use and occupancy restrictions. According to our lease, the building was zoned and registered as residential only. No commercial activities. No business operations. And definitely no use of residential units for anything other than standard domiciliary purposes by approved tenants only. Rick had been using that upstairs apartment as his unofficial office for months. Storing business equipment, meeting with contractors, and apparently using it as his personal love nest. Every time he conducted business up there, he was violating not just our lease terms, but city zoning laws. Then I started walking the building with fresh eyes. The fire escape on the east side had been blocked by construction materials for 8 months. The basement storage area had a gas leak I'd reported twice with no response. Half the smoke detectors were the old, non-compliant models that should have been replaced years ago. The parking area had potholes deep enough to swallow a small car. But the real beauty was in the building's official registration documents, which I pulled from the city website that evening. Rick had been collecting rent from 12 units, but the building was only licensed for 10 residential occupancies. The 2 extra units he'd created by subdividing larger apartments weren't legal, which meant the rent from those units was essentially theft, and every tenant in the building had grounds for legal action. I spent 3 days documenting everything. Photos, city code violations, lease discrepancies, maintenance requests that had been ignored. I even found out that Rick had been entering apartments without proper notice. Mrs. Chen mentioned he'd been in her unit, fixing things, while she was at work, with number 24-hour written notice as required by law. Meanwhile, Sarah kept up her performance. Smiling at dinner, asking about my day, even initiating sex for the first time in weeks, which made me feel physically sick knowing where she'd been that afternoon. Thursday evening, Rick made it easy for me. He showed up at our door around 7 p.m., that familiar sleazy grin plastered on his face, gold chain catching the hallway light. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Something smug and challenging. Jake, buddy, he said, not waiting for an invitation before pushing past me into our apartment. We need to talk. Sarah appeared from the kitchen like she'd been summoned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The look that passed between her and Rick lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it told me everything I needed to know. They'd planned this. What's on your mind, Rick? I asked, keeping my voice level even as my pulse hammered against my throat. He settled onto our couch like he owned the place, which, technically, he did. Well, here's the thing, Jake. Sarah and I have been talking. The casual way he said her name, like they were old friends, made my stomach clench. Sarah stood frozen by the kitchen doorway, dish towel still in her hands, looking everywhere except at me. Talking about what? I already knew, but I needed to hear him say it. Rick's grin widened. About how you're not really making her happy anymore, buddy. Haven't been for a while now. And see, Sarah's been confiding in me about some concerns she has about this relationship. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice smaller than usual. Jake, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. Like what, Sarah? I cut her off. What exactly happened? Rick laughed, actually laughed, and leaned back against our couch cushions. Come on, man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah's moving on. Hell, she's already moved on, if you know what I mean. The bastard winked at me. The thing is, Rick continued, this puts me in an awkward position as your landlord. Having my girlfriend living with some other guy in one of my properties creates a weird dynamic, you understand. My girlfriend. He'd called Sarah his girlfriend. So here's what we're gonna do, Rick said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. 30-day notice to vacate. Nothing personal, Jake. Just business. He tossed the notice onto our coffee table like he was dealing cards. I stared at it, the official letterhead swimming in my vision. You can't just evict me without cause, I said quietly. Actually, I can. Rick's voice took on that condescending tone I'd heard him use with other tenants. Section 8 of your lease agreement. I can terminate tenancy with proper notice for any reason, or no reason at all. It's all legal, buddy. Had my lawyer draw up that lease personally. That was his first mistake. His lawyer clearly hadn't done a very good job. Sarah was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. Jake, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But Rick and we have something real. And he can offer me things. Things I can't. I finished for her. She nodded miserably. Rick stood up, straightening his jacket with theatrical flair. Look, I'm not the bad guy here. Sarah's a grown woman who made a choice. And honestly, Jake, you should be thanking me. Better she figures out what she wants now than after you two get married or whatever. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and don't even think about making this difficult. I've got connections in this city. Property management is a tight community, and word gets around about problem tenants. You don't want to make an enemy out of me. After they left, together, Sarah grabbing a hastily packed overnight bag without meeting my eyes, I sat alone in our apartment that no longer felt like ours. But instead of despair, I felt something else settling into my chest. Cold, calculated anger. Rick thought he held all the cards. He thought his poorly written lease and his connections made him untouchable. He thought he could manipulate vulnerable tenants and steal their girlfriends without consequences. I picked up the eviction notice and read it carefully. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the photos I'd been collecting all week. Time to show Rick Castellanos what a real problem tenant looked like. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to war. My first stop was the city's housing authority office, a depressing government building that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. I'd been there once before to help my neighbor dispute a bogus security deposit claim, so I knew the drill. I need to file a formal complaint against my landlord, I told the clerk, a middle-aged woman named Janet whose desk nameplate suggested she'd been dealing with slumlords since before I was born. What's the nature of the complaint? She asked, pulling out a thick stack of forms. Multiple housing code violations, illegal unit conversions, and improper business use of residential property. I slid my folder across her desk. I've got documentation. Janet's eyebrows rose as she flipped through my photos and violation lists. This is comprehensive. How long did it take you to compile all this? 3 days of really paying attention, I said. Turns out when you actually look, there's a lot to see. She stamped my complaint forms and handed me a receipt. An inspector will be out within 2 weeks. In the meantime, you might want to consider contacting tenant advocacy groups. This level of negligence could be grounds for a class action suit. That gave me an idea. I spent the afternoon tracking down other tenants in Rick's properties. Mrs. Chen was eager to talk once she realized someone was actually listening. The college kids upstairs had been dealing with a broken heater for 6 months. The single mom in 2B had been threatened with eviction when she asked Rick to fix her leaking ceiling. But it was Marcus, the guy in the converted basement unit, who gave me the real ammunition. Man, I've been wondering if my apartment is even legal, he said, letting me into his cramped space. There's no windows except those little ones up near the ceiling, and I swear the ceiling height isn't right. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a tomb. I measured the ceiling with a tape measure app on my phone. 7 feet, 2 inches. City code required 7.6 minimum for habitable spaces. Marcus, I said carefully, how much rent do you pay? $1,200 a month. Why? I pulled up the city's zoning records on my phone. Because according to this, your unit doesn't legally exist. You've been paying rent on an illegal apartment for how long? 8 months. That was nearly $10,000 in illegal rent collection. In our state, landlords who knowingly rent illegal units are liable for triple damages plus legal fees. I was building a case that could financially destroy Rick, but I needed something bigger. Something that would hit him where it really hurt. That evening, I got my break from an unexpected source. Sarah texted me around 9 p.m., can we talk? I feel terrible about how this happened. Part of me wanted to ignore her, but I needed information. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where I could keep my emotions in check. She looked tired, older somehow. The excitement I'd heard in her voice 2 days ago had been replaced by something that looked a lot like regret. Rick's not who I thought he was, she said without preamble. He's controlling. Possessive. He wants me to move into that apartment upstairs, but Jake, it's gross up there. Like a teenager's bedroom mixed with a storage unit. So what do you want from me, Sarah? I made a mistake. She reached across the table like she might touch my hand, then pulled back. Rick told me he was going to evict you anyway, said you were behind on rent and causing problems. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor by offering me a way out before things got ugly. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I've never been late on rent. Not once. I know that now, she whispered. Jake, I think he's been planning this for a while. He knew exactly what to say to make me doubt us, doubt you. And now he's talking about how I need to cut ties with all my friends, how he can take better care of me than anyone else. The manipulation was textbook. Rick hadn't just stolen my girlfriend, he'd groomed her, isolated her, and was now trying to control her completely. Sarah, I said carefully, I need you to tell me everything he said about his business, his properties, his plans. Can you do that? She nodded, and for the next hour, she unknowingly handed me the keys to Rick's destruction. Sarah's information was better than I could have hoped for, but it came with a complication I hadn't expected. He keeps all his business records in that upstairs apartment, she told me, stirring her coffee nervously. Boxes of them. Tax documents, lease agreements for all his properties, bank statements. He's paranoid about keeping everything physical instead of digital because he says lawyers can't subpoena what doesn't exist on computers. My pulse quickened. Those records could contain evidence of systematic fraud across all his properties, fake maintenance charges, illegal rent increases, security deposits that were never returned. But there was a problem. Jake, there's something else, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Rick's been doing this for years. Not just the affairs, the whole manipulation thing. He showed me photos on his phone of other women he's been with. Tenants from his other buildings. He thinks it's funny, like he's collecting trophies. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm. How many? At least 6 that I saw. Maybe more. She wrapped her hands around her cup like she was trying to warm herself. And Jake, some of them looked really young. College age, maybe younger. He said something about how financial pressure makes people flexible with their boundaries. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Rick was a predator, and I was probably looking at years of systematic abuse of vulnerable tenants. But Sarah's revelation came with a catch that made my stomach drop. He wants me to help him, she said, barely audible now. He's been talking about expanding his operations, buying more properties. He thinks I'd be good at identifying potential targets. Women who are struggling financially, who might be open to arrangements. The word hung in the air between us like poison. Sarah, you have to get out of there. Tonight. I can't. She shook her head frantically. You don't understand. He has photos of us together. Intimate photos. He took them without asking, and when I got upset, he said they were insurance to make sure I didn't get any ideas about leaving or talking to anyone. Blackmail. The bastard was blackmailing her. He also. She hesitated, then pulled up her sleeve. A bracelet I'd never seen before circled her wrist, expensive looking, definitely real gold. He's been buying me things. Expensive things. And he's been very clear that he expects me to be grateful for his generosity. He said if I ever tried to leave him, he'd report the gifts as stolen property. He has receipts that don't have my name on them. My hands clenched into fists under the table. Rick hadn't just manipulated Sarah into an affair, he'd systematically trapped her in an abusive relationship using classic predator tactics. Financial leverage, compromising photos, isolation from support systems. But Sarah wasn't done dropping bombshells. There's more, Jake. He's planning to evict more people from your building. Mrs. Chen, the college kids upstairs, Marcus in the basement. He wants to renovate the units and charge double the rent. But he's not going to do it legally, he's going to make their lives miserable until they leave on their own. Cut utilities, refuse maintenance, claim they're violating lease terms. When is this supposed to happen? Soon. He's already contacted some contractors about starting work next month. He figures if he can get everyone out in the next few weeks, he can have the building renovated and filled with new tenants by spring. The timeline changed everything. I'd been planning a careful, methodical legal campaign that could take months to resolve. But if Rick was planning mass evictions, I needed to move faster. Sarah, I need you to do something for me. Something dangerous. She looked up at me with eyes that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place. I need you to get me access to those records in his apartment. Just for a few hours. Jake, no. If he catches us. He won't. Because you're going to help me make sure he's nowhere near the building when it happens. The plan forming in my head was risky as hell, but it was the only way to move fast enough to save the other tenants and gather the evidence needed to destroy Rick permanently. I just hoped Sarah was brave enough to help me pull it off. Sarah stared at me across the coffee shop table like I'd just asked her to help me rob a bank. Which, in a way, I guess I had. You're talking about breaking and entering, she whispered. That's a felony, Jake. It's not breaking and entering if you have legitimate access, I said, pulling up legal definitions on my phone. You're his girlfriend, right? He gave you a key. She nodded reluctantly, fingering the gold chain around her neck where a small key hung like a pendant. I'd noticed it earlier but assumed it was just jewelry. Then it's not illegal for you to be there. And as your friend, helping you retrieve your personal belongings, I'd have implied permission to accompany you. That's a pretty thin legal argument. Thin is better than nothing. Besides, we're not stealing anything. I just need photos of documents. Evidence of what he's been doing to other tenants. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her coffee. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes, harder, more resolved. There's something else you should know, she said. Rick's been getting calls. From someone he calls his guy at the housing authority. Someone who's been giving him heads up about inspections, complaints, that kind of thing. My blood went cold. What kind of heads up? He knew about your complaint before you even filed it. This guy, Rick calls him Jimmy, told him someone had been asking questions about his properties downtown. Rick laughed about it, said he had a few days to clean things up before any official inspection happened. The coffee shop felt like it was spinning. My carefully planned legal assault had been compromised before it even began. Rick had inside information, which meant he'd have time to address the most obvious violations and discredit my complaints. Sarah, this is huge. If Rick has someone inside the housing authority feeding him information. It gets worse, she interrupted. Jimmy's not just giving him inspection warnings. He's been helping Rick identify which complaints are worth worrying about and which tenants he can safely target for retaliation. Rick has files on problem tenants going back years. Files. Photos, financial information, personal details. Anything that could be used to intimidate someone into dropping a complaint or moving out quietly. He showed me yours yesterday. My mouth went dry. My file? Sarah nodded miserably. He knows about your dad's contracting business, your ex-girlfriend Emma from college, even your mom's medical bills from last year. He said if you pushed back against the eviction, he had ways to make things complicated for your family. The scope of Rick's operation was becoming clear, and it was so much worse than just a sleazy landlord cutting corners. This was organized harassment and intimidation, backed by corrupt officials and targeting the most vulnerable people in the city. But Sarah's revelations also gave me something I hadn't expected, leverage of my own. Sarah, do you know Jimmy's real name? His position at the housing authority? James Morrison. Rick calls him Deputy Morrison sometimes, like he's proud of having a cop friend. But I think he works for the city, not the police. I pulled up the housing authority website on my phone and found him in 30 seconds. Deputy Housing Inspector James Morrison, 15-year veteran, currently assigned to the downtown district. His bio mentioned his commitment to fair housing practices and protecting tenant rights. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so sickening. Sarah, I think we just found our smoking gun. But getting to it is going to be more dangerous than I thought. Because now I wasn't just going up against Rick, I was facing a conspiracy that reached into city government itself. The next 3 days were a masterclass in paranoia. Every phone call could be monitored. Every email might be forwarded to Rick through his inside connection. I couldn't trust official channels, couldn't rely on the housing authority, and couldn't even be sure which other city departments might be compromised. But I could still think like an accountant. While Sarah played her role as Rick's devoted new girlfriend, I started following the money. Public records showed Rick's property acquisitions over the past 5 years, always bought cheap from desperate sellers, always in neighborhoods right on the edge of gentrification. The pattern suggested he had advanced knowledge of development plans, zoning changes, and city improvement projects. Information that would be worth a fortune to someone willing to exploit it. I spent my lunch breaks at the public library, using their computers to avoid creating digital footprints Rick's contact might trace back to me. What I found made my stomach churn. Property tax assessments that didn't match actual sale prices. Building permits filed and approved in record time while neighboring properties waited months for similar approvals. Code violations that disappeared from official records without any corresponding repair work. Jimmy Morrison wasn't just feeding Rick information, he was actively manipulating the system to benefit Rick's business empire. But documentation was one thing. Proof was another. Thursday evening, Sarah called me from Rick's apartment, her voice carefully modulated like she was performing for an audience. Hey Jake, I left some textbooks at the old place. Mind if I swing by tomorrow afternoon to grab them? The subtext was clear, Rick would be listening, but she was setting up our window. Sure, I'll be at work until 6, I replied, matching her casual tone while my heart hammered against my ribs. Perfect. I should be done by 5. After hanging up, I realized the flaw in our plan. If Rick was suspicious enough to monitor Sarah's calls, he'd be suspicious enough to verify my schedule. A quick call to my office would confirm I'd requested Friday afternoon off. I needed a backup story that would hold up to scrutiny. Friday morning, I called in with a migraine, loud enough for my cubicle neighbors to hear, dramatic enough to be memorable. Then I posted on social media about spending the day in a dark room, even asking a friend to respond with sympathy. If anyone checked my digital footprint, they'd find a convincing trail of someone too sick to leave his apartment. At 2 p.m., I watched from my car as Rick's BMW pulled out of the building parking lot. Sarah was in the passenger seat, playing her part perfectly. According to the plan, she was taking him across town to look at a potential property acquisition, something that would keep him occupied for at least 2 hours. I gave them 10 minutes, then made my move. The building felt different as I climbed the stairs to Rick's apartment. Every creak of the floorboard sounded amplified, every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Sarah had left the door unlocked, but my hand still shook as I turned the handle. Inside, the apartment was exactly as Sarah had described, a bizarre combination of storage unit and bachelor pad. Boxes of documents stacked against one wall, expensive electronics scattered around a leather couch that probably cost more than most of his tenants' annual rent. I started with the filing cabinet in the corner, methodically photographing every document with my phone. Lease agreements with illegal clauses. Maintenance requests that had been deliberately ignored. Security deposits transferred to personal accounts instead of the required escrow funds. But it was the fourth box that made me stop breathing. Photos. Dozens of them. Women in compromising positions, clearly taken without consent. Some I recognized as former tenants Sarah had mentioned. Others were strangers, but all had the same look, young, vulnerable, financially desperate. And underneath the photos, a ledger. Names, addresses, dates, and dollar amounts. Rick had been running something between a protection racket and a prostitution ring, using his position as landlord to coerce vulnerable women into arrangements that reduced their rent in exchange for services. The scope of it made me dizzy. This wasn't just fraud, it was systematic sexual exploitation on a scale that could destroy dozens of lives if it came to light the wrong way. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, problem. Coming back early. I had maybe 15 minutes before Rick returned, and I'd only photographed half the evidence. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I froze, phone still in my hand, surrounded by boxes of evidence that could send Rick to prison for decades. The footsteps were too heavy to be Sarah, too deliberate to be a random tenant. My mind raced through possibilities: maintenance worker, delivery person, or worst-case scenario, Rick himself. 3 soft knocks echoed through the apartment. Maintenance, a gruff voice called out. Need to check the water pressure upstairs. I almost laughed with relief until I remembered Sarah mentioning that Rick handled all maintenance requests himself. He didn't hire outside contractors for routine work, especially not on Fridays when he usually spent the afternoon collecting rent from his other properties. This wasn't maintenance. This was either one of Rick's associates or someone else entirely, and neither option was good for me. The knocking came again, more insistent. Hello? Anyone home? Got reports of low water pressure from the unit below. I quickly shoved the photos back into their box and closed the filing cabinet as quietly as possible. Through the peephole, I could see a man in coveralls holding an official-looking clipboard, but something about his posture screamed fake. Real maintenance workers didn't stand like ex-cops trying to look casual. My phone buzzed again. I got suspicious. Driving back now. 10 minutes. The man outside tried the door handle. Locked, thankfully, but I could hear him muttering something into what sounded like a radio. This was coordinated. I moved to the window and looked down at the parking lot. A white van sat in the visitor spaces, not Rick's BMW, but not a city maintenance vehicle either. No official logos, no company markings, just generic white paint and tinted windows. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Rick's guy at the housing authority hadn't just been feeding him information about my complaint. Jimmy Morrison had been monitoring the situation, and when Rick called in a panic about Sarah's suspicious behavior, they'd sent someone to check the apartment. I was trapped in Rick's apartment with evidence of massive criminal enterprise while unknown associates prowled the hallway and Rick himself raced back to catch me in the act. The man outside had stopped knocking, but I could hear him talking quietly, probably reporting that the apartment was locked and appeared empty. That bought me maybe 5 minutes before they decided to use alternative entry methods. I quickly returned to the filing cabinet, photographing documents as fast as my phone could process them. Tax returns showing income that didn't match reported rental revenue. Bank statements from accounts in different names. Wire transfers to offshore companies that screamed money laundering. But the real treasure was in a manila folder marked insurance, copies of communications between Rick and Jimmy Morrison going back 3 years. Email printouts discussing problem tenants and cleanup operations. Payment schedules that looked suspiciously like bribes disguised as consulting fees. One email made my blood freeze: new tenant in 4B asking too many questions about building codes. Recommend immediate action before he contacts state authorities. Standard intimidation protocol should suffice, but prepare to escalate if necessary. The email was dated 3 days ago. I was the tenant in 4B. My phone rang, Sarah's number flashing on the screen. I answered immediately. Jake, get out now, she whispered urgently. Rick knows something's wrong. He's calling people, getting angry. He said something about cleaning house and making sure loose ends don't become problems. Through the window, I saw Rick's BMW turning into the parking lot, moving fast enough to suggest panic rather than routine return. I was about to be caught red-handed in the apartment of a man who had just been discussing my elimination as a problem tenant, surrounded by evidence that could implicate city officials in a massive corruption scandal. The footsteps in the hallway had multiplied. At least 2 people now, possibly 3. And I still hadn't found the most important thing: proof of Rick's connection to other properties, other victims, other crimes that could finally bring down his entire operation. Time was up. I had maybe 2 minutes before Rick reached the apartment, and the men in the hallway were getting restless. Through the thin door, I could hear one of them testing keys, probably master keys that would open any unit in the building. Rick's corruption network was more extensive than I'd imagined because associates had building access. But Sarah's warning about cleaning house echoed in my head as I made a desperate decision. Instead of running, I grabbed the manila folder labeled Current Operations that I'd spotted earlier but hadn't had time to examine. Inside were active files on tenants across all of Rick's properties. Photos, personal information, and what looked like psychological profiles designed to identify manipulation targets. But worse than that were the documents marked phase-out candidates, a hit list of tenants scheduled for forced removal. Mrs. Chen was on the list, marked for health code violation setup. The college kids upstairs were tagged for noise complaint harassment. Marcus in the basement apartment was marked illegal occupancy exposure. They planned to anonymously report his unit to the city, then evict him when it was condemned. And at the bottom of the list, added in fresh ink, Jake Morrison, 4B, escalated threat level. Immediate action required. My hands shook as I photographed the pages. Morrison. They'd listed my last name as Morrison, the same as Jimmy, Rick's inside man at the housing authority. Either it was a coincidence, or... The realization hit me like ice water. They thought I was related to Jimmy Morrison. That's why Rick had been so confident about having connections who could make my life difficult. He thought I was the deputy inspector's son or nephew, someone with inside knowledge of the housing authority's operations. That's why the corruption ran so deep, why they had master keys, why mysterious maintenance workers appeared within hours of my breaking into the apartment. They weren't just covering their tracks, they were protecting themselves from what they assumed was an internal threat. The door handle rattled as someone inserted a key. I shoved the folder back into place and dug behind the couch, pulling out my phone to send the most important text of my life. Sarah, they think I'm related to Jimmy Morrison from Housing Authority. That's why Rick is panicking. Play along with this misunderstanding when he asks. The apartment door opened just as Rick's voice echoed up the stairwell, shouting something about that little bastard and family loyalty. 2 men entered the apartment, the fake maintenance worker and someone new wearing a security guard uniform that looked official enough to fool most people. They moved like professionals, systematically checking the space while speaking in low voices. Anything disturbed? The security guard asked. Filing cabinet's been accessed recently, the maintenance worker replied, running his finger along the cabinet's edge. Fresh fingerprints on the handles, and the dust pattern's been disrupted. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain they'd hear it, but the sound of Rick's heavy footsteps on the stairs covered any noise I might have made. Well. Rick's voice boomed as he entered the apartment, slightly out of breath from rushing up the stairs. Someone's been here, the security guard confirmed. Professional job, though. Nothing obviously missing, no signs of forced entry. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were looking for. Rick's laugh was bitter and angry. Of course he knew what to look for. Jimmy's nephew probably grew up hearing about housing violations over Sunday dinner. Question is, how much did he see? Through a gap in the couch cushions, I watched Rick pace the small space like a caged animal, his usually slick back hair disheveled with stress. The question, Rick continued, is whether we're dealing with a family dispute or something bigger. The security guard checked his watch. Your girlfriend's downstairs. Wants to know if you need her to come up. Send her away, Rick snapped. This is business now. The security guard spoke quietly into his radio, and I heard Sarah's voice crackle through the speaker, high-pitched with barely controlled panic. Rick, please, I just want to help. Tell her to go back to her place and wait, Rick interrupted. And make sure she understands that waiting quietly is in everyone's best interest right now. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah had become a liability, and Rick was making it clear that her safety depended on her compliance. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to burst out from behind the couch and defend her. Getting myself killed wouldn't help anyone. Boss, the maintenance worker said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. We've got another problem. Jimmy's been trying to reach you for the past hour. Says there's been unusual activity on the Housing Authority's database. Someone's been running extensive searches on your properties. Rick stopped pacing. What kind of searches? Historical records, violation reports, inspection schedules. The kind of deep dive that takes hours and requires specific access codes. Access codes that Jimmy's nephew would have, Rick muttered, his voice growing colder. The little bastard's been planning this for longer than we thought. The security guard pulled out a tablet, swiping through what looked like surveillance footage. We've got cameras on 3 of your buildings downtown. Want me to review the past week, see if we can establish a pattern of reconnaissance? My mouth went dry. Cameras. I'd spent days walking around Rick's properties, taking photos, measuring violations, talking to other tenants. If they had comprehensive surveillance footage, they could piece together my entire investigation and identify everyone who'd helped me. Do it, Rick said. And cross-reference with Jimmy's database access logs. I want to know exactly what this kid saw and who he's been talking to. The maintenance worker was back at the filing cabinet, systematically checking each drawer. Some of these folders have been moved recently. The insurance documents, the operations files, even some of the personal collections. Personal collections. The photos of Rick's victims. My stomach churned as I realized the full scope of what I'd uncovered, and what Rick was willing to do to protect it. How long do you think he was here? Rick asked. Based on the disturbance patterns, at least 30 minutes. Maybe longer. The maintenance worker straightened up, his expression grim. Long enough to photograph everything. Rick's face flushed red. Then we're past the point of quiet solutions. If Jimmy's nephew has documentation of our arrangement, this becomes a matter of mutual survival. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Jimmy. Yeah, it's me. We need to meet. Tonight. And bring your cleanup contacts, the kind who specialize in permanent problem resolution. The phrase, permanent problem resolution, made my blood turn to ice. They weren't just talking about evicting me anymore. Rick's criminal enterprise was too valuable, too extensive, and too interconnected to risk exposure. They were planning to make me disappear entirely. The security guard checked his watch again. What about the girlfriend? She knows too much to leave loose. Rick was quiet for a moment, considering. Sarah's useful for now. Gives us leverage and keeps up appearances. But after we resolve the nephew situation. He shrugged, the gesture more chilling than any direct threat. I had to get out of that apartment, had to warn Sarah, had to find a way to expose Rick's operation before they could silence both of us permanently. But with 3 men between me and the door, and surveillance networks tracking my every move, escape seemed impossible. That's when I heard the fire alarm go off. The fire alarm's shrill wail filled the apartment, and for a split second, all 4 of us froze. Rick's face went from rage to confusion as the building's evacuation system kicked into high gear, emergency lights flashing in the hallway outside. What the hell? Rick muttered, moving toward the window to look down at the parking lot. The security guard was already speaking into his radio. Control, we've got a fire alarm at the downtown property. Are you showing any emergency response dispatch to this location? Through the crackling response, I heard, negative. No fire department calls logged for that address. Rick's eyes narrowed with understanding. It's a diversion. The nephews got help. But I was just as confused as they were. Sarah was downstairs, supposedly waiting in the car. I hadn't coordinated any backup plan, hadn't told anyone else about today's operation. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, but I had no idea who was pulling the fire alarm or why. The maintenance worker moved to the door, checking the hallway. Building's evacuating. We've got maybe 2 minutes before fire department shows up, alarm or no alarm. Someone's gonna call it in. Search faster, Rick ordered, his composure cracking. If there's anything here that could compromise us, I need to know now. That's when I realized my phone was still connected to Sarah's call from earlier. The line had stayed open, which meant she'd heard everything, Rick's threats, the conversation about permanent problem resolution, the plan to make both of us disappear. Sarah had pulled the fire alarm. The security guard was getting agitated. Boss, we need to clear out. Too many variables, too much exposure. Even if this is a setup, staying here during a building evacuation looks suspicious. Give me 30 seconds, the maintenance worker insisted, now frantically rifling through the boxes I'd been photographing. If he got photos of the Morrison correspondence, we need to know which. He stopped mid-sentence, holding up a folder that looked different from the others. This wasn't here before. Someone planted something. Rick grabbed the folder, his face going white as he opened it. Son of a bitch. These are copies of documents from Jimmy's office. Bank records, email printouts, meeting schedules. This isn't just reconnaissance, someone's been building a federal case. My confusion deepened. I hadn't planted anything, and I certainly hadn't had access to Jimmy Morrison's office files. But as Rick read through the documents, his panic was escalating to dangerous levels. These transactions go back 5 years, Rick continued, his voice tight with fear. Property transfers, inspection schedules, even correspondence with the mayor's office about development priorities. If this gets to the FBI. The security guard snatched his radio. All units, we've got a code red situation. Assume federal surveillance and act accordingly. Initiate contingency protocols immediately. Through the apartment window, I could see tenants evacuating into the parking lot below, but I also spotted something that made my heart race, 3 black SUVs positioned at strategic points around the building. Government plates. Federal agents. Rick saw them too. We're blown. This whole thing was a setup from the beginning. The maintenance worker was backing toward the door. Boss, I'm gone. This is way above my pay grade. Nobody leaves, Rick snarled, pulling something from his jacket that made my blood freeze. A gun, small but unmistakably real. If we're going down together. And we're taking Jimmy's nephew with us. The apartment fell deadly quiet except for the continuing wail of the fire alarm. Rick's 2 associates exchanged glances that suggested this level of desperation was new territory for all of them. Outside, I could hear voices in the hallway, official sounding, authoritative, moving with purpose. The federal agents weren't waiting for the building to clear. They were coming up. Bathroom window, the security guard whispered urgently. Fire escape access. We can still. No, Rick cut him off, his grip tightening on the weapon. We finish this first. Find the nephew, get him talking about who he's working with, then we use him as leverage to negotiate. They thought I was still somewhere in the building, probably trying to escape with the other tenants. They had no idea I was 6 feet away, trapped behind a couch, listening to them plan my interrogation and murder. The voices in the hallway were getting closer, and Rick's paranoia was reaching a breaking point that could turn violent at any second. The voices in the hallway stopped right outside the door. Through the thin walls, I could hear multiple people talking in the professional, clipped tones that screamed federal agents. Rick heard it too, his face cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light, fear, rage, calculation. Federal agents, the security guard whispered, confirming what we all knew. They're not here for a building inspection. Rick's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his weapon, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool apartment air. Jimmy sold us out. Had to be Jimmy. Nobody else had access to those files. But I was hearing something else through the door, Sarah's voice, high and stressed, talking to whoever was out there. She wasn't downstairs waiting in the car. She was in the hallway with federal agents, and from the sound of it, she was cooperating. The apartment's been used as an office, Sarah was saying. Financial records, tenant files, everything's in there. But Rick's been getting paranoid lately, talking about cleaning house. My blood ran cold. Sarah wasn't just cooperating, she was actively helping them build their case. Which meant either she'd been working with law enforcement longer than I knew, or she'd made a deal to save herself when Rick's operation started collapsing. Rick must have reached the same conclusion because his face went dark with betrayal and fury. That little bitch, he hissed. She's been playing both sides this whole time. The maintenance worker was edging toward the bathroom, clearly planning an escape route regardless of Rick's orders. Boss, we need to move. Now. Every second we stay here makes this worse. Nobody moves until I figure out how deep this goes, Rick snapped, but his authority was cracking. The security guard was also eyeing the exits, and I could see the exact moment when Rick realized his crew was about to abandon him. That's when someone knocked on the door. Not the tentative maintenance knock from earlier, but the authoritative rap of law enforcement. Rick Castellanos. FBI. We need to talk. The apartment fell silent except for the fire alarm, which was still wailing like a banshee. Rick looked around wildly, his weapon now pointed at nothing and everything simultaneously. We know you're in there, Rick. We've got surveillance footage, financial records, witness testimony. This can go easy or hard, but it's going to go. Through the door's peephole, Rick would be able to see at least 3 agents in bulletproof vests. Professional, prepared, and patient in a way that suggested they had all day and a building surrounded. How? Rick whispered, more to himself than anyone else. How did they get surveillance footage? How did they get Jimmy's files? The security guard finally found his voice. Boss, maybe Jimmy didn't sell us out. Maybe Jimmy got caught, and this whole thing's been unraveling for weeks without us knowing it. That possibility seemed to hit Rick like a physical blow. If Jimmy Morrison had been arrested or flipped weeks ago, then every conversation, every transaction, every crime they'd committed since then had potentially been monitored by federal investigators. Mr. Castellanos, the voice called through the door again. We know about the illegal units, the coercion scheme, the housing authority corruption. We also know there are people in that building who don't need to go down with this ship. Make the smart choice. Rick's paranoia crystallized into a single, terrifying focus. His eyes swept the apartment, and I realized he was looking for me. Not Jake the random tenant, but the person he still believed was Jimmy Morrison's nephew, the inside source who could have orchestrated this entire federal operation. You're in here somewhere, Rick said quietly, his voice taking on the deadly calm that was somehow more frightening than his earlier panic. Jimmy's nephew. The little spy who brought down my whole operation. He started moving through the apartment systematically, weapon raised, checking behind boxes and furniture. The maintenance worker and security guard watched in horror as their boss completely lost touch with reality, hunting for a ghost while federal agents prepared to breach the door. I had maybe 30 seconds before Rick's search pattern reached the couch where I was hiding. And I was starting to realize that Sarah's cooperation with the FBI might be more complicated than a simple betrayal, because if they had surveillance footage and financial records going back weeks, someone had been investigating Rick's operation long before I ever discovered the affair. Someone had been using me as an unwitting asset in a much larger takedown operation. The question was whether I was going to survive long enough to find out who. Rick's methodical search was 3 pieces of furniture away from my hiding spot when the apartment door exploded inward. FBI. Drop your weapon. The next 10 seconds felt like they happened underwater. Rick spun toward the door, his gun wavering between the federal agents and the couch where I was hidden. The maintenance worker dove behind the filing cabinet while the security guard threw his hands up and started shouting something about cooperation. I want to talk to Jimmy Morrison. Rick screamed at the agents, his voice cracking with desperation. I want to know why his nephew destroyed my life. Sir, put down the weapon and we can discuss. His nephew's in here somewhere. Rick interrupted, backing toward my hiding spot. The little bastard's been spying on me for weeks, feeding information to his uncle. Agent Williams, according to the name on his vest, kept his weapon trained on Rick but his voice remained calm. Sir, there is no nephew. Jimmy Morrison's family lives in Oregon. You've been investigating by a civilian tenant who filed a complaint about housing violations. Rick's face went blank with confusion. What? Jake Hoffman, apartment 4B. College graduate, no relation to any law enforcement personnel. He filed a housing complaint against you 6 days ago, which triggered our investigation into Deputy Inspector Morrison's activities. The pieces were clicking together in Rick's mind, and I could see the exact moment when he realized the scope of his paranoia. There was no family connection, no inside conspiracy, no deep cover operation. Just a pissed-off tenant with good documentation skills who'd accidentally uncovered a massive corruption ring. But that realization made Rick more dangerous, not less. 6 days, he whispered, then his voice exploded with rage. 6 fucking days of panic, 6 days of burning bridges and calling in favors, 6 days of planning to murder some college kid because I thought. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes finding mine through the gap in the couch cushions. There you are. The gun swung toward me just as Agent Williams shouted another warning. I rolled sideways as the couch exploded in stuffing and splinters, Rick's first shot going wide but close enough that I felt the heat. He's behind the couch, the security guard yelled, apparently deciding that cooperation meant giving Rick better targeting information. I scrambled on hands and knees toward the kitchen area, my ears ringing from the gunshot in the enclosed space. Rick was screaming something about fixing his mistakes while federal agents tried to get a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting me. That's when Sarah's voice cut through the chaos from the hallway. Jake. The bathroom window leads to the fire escape. Rick whirled toward the sound of her voice. Sarah. You lying, manipulative. His second shot shattered the door frame where Sarah had been standing, but Agent Williams used the distraction to rush forward. The tackle sent both men crashing into the filing cabinet, documents scattering everywhere as they fought for control of the weapon. I made it to the bathroom and found the window Sarah had mentioned, but my relief evaporated when I looked outside. The fire escape was there, but so were 2 more federal agents positioned to catch anyone trying to flee. They saw me in the window and one of them shouted up, "Stay where you are. Do not attempt to leave the building." Behind me, the sounds of the struggle intensified. Something heavy crashed to the floor, followed by Agent Williams shouting, "Weapon secured," and the distinctive click of handcuffs. I slumped against the bathroom wall, adrenaline finally catching up with me. Rick Castellanos was in custody, his corruption network was blown wide open, and somehow I'd survived being hunted by a delusional landlord who thought I was part of a federal conspiracy. But Sarah's voice in the hallway raised new questions. How had she known about the bathroom window? How had she coordinated with federal agents who claimed their investigation only started 6 days ago? And why did Agent Williams seem to know exactly where to find me in an apartment he'd never seen before? Agent Williams helped me out of the bathroom while his partner finished securing Rick and the 2 accomplices. My legs felt like jelly, but the adrenaline was keeping me upright as I tried to process everything that had just happened. Mr. Hoffman, Agent Williams said, his tone professional but not unkind. We need to ask you some questions about what you've witnessed here today. Questions. I managed, my voice hoarser than expected. I think I'm the one who should be asking questions. Like, how did you know I was behind that couch? And why does it feel like you've been watching this whole thing play out? Before he could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She looked pale and shaken, but there was something else in her expression, relief mixed with what looked disturbingly like guilt. Jake, thank God you're okay, she said, but she didn't move toward me. Instead, she stayed close to another agent, a woman in a dark suit who'd been taking notes throughout the arrest. Sarah, I said carefully, how did you know about the bathroom window? You told me you'd only been in this apartment a few times. The pause before her answer was too long. Way too long. Rick showed me around when we first. She trailed off, glancing at Agent Williams like she was asking permission to continue. That's when it hit me. The coordination had been too perfect. The federal agents had arrived too quickly. The evidence had been too comprehensive for a 6-day investigation. She's been working with you, I said to Agent Williams. It wasn't a question. This whole thing, the affair, the breakup, getting me angry enough to investigate Rick, it was all orchestrated. Agent Williams exchanged a look with his female colleague before sighing. Mr. Hoffman, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. No. I stepped back, my mind racing through the past week's events with new understanding. Right here, right now. How long has Sarah been cooperating with the FBI? Sarah's face crumpled. Jake, please understand. They approached me 3 months ago. They knew Rick was targeting me, and they offered me a way out that could also help other women. 3 months. 3 months of lies, manipulation, and performance. Every moment of our relationship deteriorating, every excuse about being too tired or stressed, every time she'd pushed me away, it had all been part of an operation. The affair was real though, wasn't it? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. That part wasn't fake. Her silence was answer enough. Agent Williams cleared his throat. Mr. Hoffman, your girlfriend was being coerced by a dangerous criminal. When we identified her as both a victim and potential asset, we offered her protection in exchange for cooperation. Your investigation was unexpected, but ultimately helpful. Helpful. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I almost got killed because you people couldn't be bothered to tell me I was wandering around in the middle of a federal operation. We couldn't risk compromising. Compromising what? I interrupted. Your asset. Is that what Sarah is to you? The female agent spoke up for the first time. Mr. Hoffman, I understand you're upset, but Miss Chen's cooperation has helped us identify at least 12 other victims and uncover corruption that reaches into multiple city departments. Miss Chen. Not Sarah Chen, my girlfriend of 2 years. Miss Chen, federal asset. I looked at Sarah, at the woman I thought I knew, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. How much of it was real? Any of it? My feelings for you were real, she whispered. But Jake, Rick was escalating. The things he was planning to do to other women, to other tenants. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen. So you destroyed our relationship instead. I saved your life, she snapped, showing the first real emotion I'd seen from her since this whole nightmare began. Rick was planning to have you killed. Not evicted, not intimidated, murdered. If I hadn't been feeding information to the FBI, if they hadn't been ready to move when he finally snapped. She was right, and I hated her for it. Agent Williams was checking his watch. We need to clear this scene and get everyone down to the field office for formal statements. Mr. Hoffman, we'll need several hours of your time to document everything you observed. As they led Rick away in handcuffs, he caught my eye one last time. You have no idea what you've started, kid, he said quietly. This goes so much deeper than you think. 6 months later, I sat in a coffee shop across the street from Rick's old building, watching the construction crews finish the renovations. Real renovations this time, legal permits, proper inspections, everything done by the book under new ownership. The FBI investigation had been even more extensive than Agent Williams initially let on. Rick's corruption network stretched across 4 city departments and involved over 30 properties. Jimmy Morrison had been arrested 2 weeks after Rick, and the ripple effects were still unfolding. The mayor's chief of staff had resigned. 3 city council members were under investigation. The whole housing authority had been restructured from the ground up. But the real victory was smaller, more personal. Mrs. Chen, the elderly tenant, not Sarah who'd kept her real surname throughout our relationship, was still living in her apartment. Rent-controlled now, properly maintained, with a landlord who actually responded to maintenance requests. The college kids upstairs had gotten a settlement that covered their tuition for the rest of the year. Marcus had been relocated to a legal apartment in a better neighborhood, with moving expenses covered by the seizure of Rick's assets. 12 other women had come forward after Rick's arrest, and Sarah's testimony had been instrumental in securing convictions for sexual coercion and extortion. Rick got 15 years federal, plus additional state charges that would keep him locked up well into his 60s. I testified at his sentencing hearing. Looked him right in the eyes as I described the fear, the helplessness, the feeling of being hunted in my own home. His lawyer had tried to paint me as a vindictive tenant seeking revenge, but the evidence spoke for itself. Financial records don't lie. Neither do photographs of illegal apartments and documented threats. Sarah had approached me after the hearing, looking tired but relieved. I know you probably hate me, she'd said, but I wanted you to know that what we had was real for me. The feelings were real, even if everything else was complicated. I'd thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. The anger had faded, replaced by something more complex. Understanding, maybe. She'd been trapped in an impossible situation, making the best choices she could with the information she had. I couldn't fault her for choosing survival, even if it meant sacrificing our relationship. My phone buzzed with a text from my dad, saw the news article about the housing reform bill. Proud of you, son. The legislation had been nicknamed the Hoffman Act by local media, though officially it was just Bill 2847. Stricter oversight of rental properties, mandatory annual inspections, and stronger protections for tenants who report violations. It wouldn't have happened without the evidence I'd accidentally uncovered, but more importantly, it meant future Rick Castellanos would have a much harder time exploiting vulnerable renters. I finished my coffee and walked toward my new apartment, a place I'd chosen carefully, with proper research into the landlord's background and a lease I'd had reviewed by an actual attorney. The security deposit was in escrow, the utilities were properly registered, and the fire escapes were unobstructed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal. Sometimes it's systemic change that prevents the same harm from happening to others. Rick had called me a problem tenant, and he'd been absolutely right. I was a problem for predators, for corruption, for anyone who thought they could abuse their power without consequences. And I was completely okay with that. The building behind me buzzed with honest construction work, proper permits visible in every window. Mrs. Chen waved at me from her balcony, where she was tending flowers in boxes that weren't violating any fire codes. Justice served, system reformed, predator caged. Mission accomplished.